Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Welcome, Bruce.
Hey, David. How are you doing today?
Good. Another of these endless days of COVID. Here we go.
Is that Howie Morenz I see peering over your right shoulder?
That is Howie Morenz.
Ah, number 7 with the Habs. Retired number. I've never seen anybody wear it.
Yeah, that is a piece of art by Edmonton folk artist Sid Kelsey, who
Sweet.
is long deceased now. Sid lived in a house just north of Commonwealth Stadium, and his yard was full of his strange and interesting folk art.
Mm-hmm.
He was from the Caribbean, and it's kind of Caribbean inspired yard decoration. Anyway, I commissioned him to do a piece of the great Howie Morenz, which is I think the archetypical Canadian hockey story. We love the game a little too much.
Yep, mandatory 1930s sports reference. We've already dealt with that now. So,
yeah,
we're off and running.
Had to shut a door there. Yeah. Yes, Howie Morenz loved the game so much that when he broke the legend has it that when he broke his leg and couldn't play anymore, he died in the hospital. I suspect that he probably died from not heartbreak, but from other reasons due to the hospital care at that time. But I don't know if we'll ever know that.
Blood clot or something maybe from the injury.
Yeah.
The Stratford. Anyway, died of a broken heart is how the legend reads. And
that's right.
Who are we to question the legend?
That's right. So, Bruce, we're going to talk today about the presumptive start of the NHL hockey season. We'll talk about some of the Oilers' issues heading into the season. And we finished up our prospect series. We had a vote, and that on the prospect rankings, and we talked about that in the last podcast. But that spurred me on to kind of answer the question, is how deep is this prospect pool? How good is this prospect pool come out? And I talked about that somewhat. I have more kind of final authoritative rankings than I had on our last podcast. Okay. And then it spurred me on to question whether or not the Oilers will be able to keep together what I think is a pretty outstanding prospect pool, probably the second best in Oilers history in terms, maybe not in terms of the absolute top end talent, but in terms of the overall depth of the prospect pool. I think it's probably the second best. It may be actually the deepest prospect pool we've ever seen, with the top end talent being far greater in a couple years at least. So we'll talk about that. So let's just quickly discuss where we're at with the season. And it seems like the owners and the players have worked out a deal which they can both live with now. If future NHL players had a vote, which they don't, they would probably vote against. They would definitely vote against this deal because essentially the players get the money now, and future generation of players are missing out. It looks like though there's a deal, and it looks like that's going to go ahead. But the only sticking point now being COVID, and it's the havoc that it continues to wreak on society and the uncertainty around that. And it looks like the problem in Canada is that there's some provincial health authorities that have questions about how the NHL is going to proceed, which is normal, right? There's huge lockdowns, shutdown, mandatory measures across Canada right now. I think it's the biggest wave that we've had. I think it's even, if you look at, I think I'm correct in saying this, if you look at national numbers across the country, that this is the biggest wave in total that we've had. All parts of the country are affected except for the Maritimes in the north, which really locked down tight and have gone for the COVID zero policy. Maybe they're more able to go for that policy, but that's again another issue. So there's just a big sticking point, Bruce, about what's going to happen here and whether they're going to have a Canadian division or where it will be in bubble cities. I suspect that they'll have at least 3 or 4 Canadian jurisdictions that will agree. Okay. The NHL going ahead, and maybe there'll be 1 or 2 that won't. So there might be a couple bubble teams or bubble cities.
Well, the current threat is to send all of the Canadian teams to the States to play the entire season there and just do away with the Canadian division now that we've been tantalized with it for the last several months, and presumably just go back to divisions as normal or similar. That to me smacks of being a power play by the NHL, trying to kind of I don't know if intimidate's the right word, but trying to bring pressure to bear on the provincial authorities in Canada to go along with their wishes. And what might be behind that, what they're looking for, is anybody's guess. You and I might speculate, but maybe this podcast isn't the place to do it because we really don't know. But it's uh, it when I read that yesterday, those tweets, it just put a chill to the whole thing for me. I mean, we're already got 6 degrees of separation from this stuff. It seems like with all that's going on, but to have the team based, all the Canadian teams based in the States for an entire year just seems unworkable to me. I just don't see how that
What do you mean by six
could play.
degrees of what do you mean by six
Well,
degrees of
I don't know. I
separation?
guess I'm still going back to the bubble playoffs where, I mean, they were right here in our city, and they might as well have been playing them on the moon. Now, hopefully, we're
Yeah.
going to get to the point where we're able to have teams traveling around, potentially starting to let fans into the building at some point during the season. But if the Edmonton Oilers are based in Bakersfield, California, that's going to make it a little tougher now, isn't it?
That's not
So,
going to happen.
I
That's not going
don't,
to happen.
yeah, I think it's a
And Bruce,
power
if it's a
play, but
also if it's a pressure tactic, it's not going to
mm,
work
that's the
because
word.
I think there's going to be some provincial health authorities that are amenable to the NHL playing, like we saw last time in Ontario and in Edmonton, right? There's going to be some governments that are just more to put it in its simplest, crudest terms, they're more business friendly, and some of them are more safety conscious. And what happened last time is in BC, they were more safety conscious, and they lost the NHL playoffs.
They took
They
themselves
felt
right out of
safe,
the running, as I
took themselves
recall.
out of
Yeah.
the running. So I don't think the threat of moving to the States is going to move a health official, let's say, and I'm just guessing here in BC, if it's consistent with last time. They're just going to, they'll think, well, the Canucks aren't, they'll just think, well, we're going to lose the Canucks. They're not going to play here. And they'll just make the same decision they made last time. And they'll say, that's okay. They can go play elsewhere. That's what the decision was in BC last time. And I could see them making that decision again because if there's no fans in the stands, as you say, it doesn't have the same import to the hockey
Right.
fans of that city. If it's just going to be on TV, the TV studio could be in Tuktoyaktuk or Patagonia. For all anyone cares, what's the difference on a certain level if there's
Right.
no fans in the stands? So, in a way, if all the Canadians just move to a TV, if all the Canadian teams just move to a TV studio in Auburn, where's Auburn, Mississippi? What difference would that make? On a certain, Jim Matheson was cheekily saying they should all move to the WHA cities, the former WHA cities, Birmingham and San Diego and places
Cincinnati,
like
eh?
that to play. So on a certain level, it doesn't really matter where the TV
Yeah,
studio is.
well,
But I do think it probably. I don't think the Edmonton Oilers are going to want to move, out of their homes, apartments,
no kidding.
and the management, the
And
staff. They want to be in their nice dressing room at home and
even
get
a, even
full
even a
advantage of.
hybrid bubble makes more sense, David. I mean, you keep the Canadian teams in Canada, and you play the opening couple of rounds of the season in an approved bubble somewhere. You get a week off here and there that you can go home, and perhaps part way through the season when the vaccine's more fully distributed and the players are in line for getting vaccinated, and the fans and so on, that things loosen up during the season. It's not like the situation that we're seeing now in December is still going to be the case next June. So to make a draconian decision like that on the entire season and moving the entire league into the United States, it just doesn't sit well.
I don't see it. I think there's like a very small chance of that happening. So especially now that we know what the problem was, like the problem seems to be like approval from provincial health authorities. This sounds like something that will be worked out in at least one Canadian city, if not many Canadian cities, and maybe there'll be Toronto Edmonton bubbles for the first. But I do think probably makes me think that that February 1st date is more likely than January 15th.
Today there was scuttlebutt. Was it Bob McKenzie? Anyway, one of the insiders saying that if January 13th or 15th start is probably off the table if they can't come to an agreement by this weekend. And if by coming to agreement they mean also reaching an agreement with provincial health authorities, well, this is Friday. It's not going to happen by this weekend. They're going to have to come up with a plan that has alternatives built into it. And tearing apart the Canadian division takes away a lot of alternatives that might work as this situation develops.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I think they're going to play somewhere. So,
meanwhile, you talk of the Edmonton bubble, and the World Juniors, which is being played in an Edmonton bubble, is already facing a problem that never happened during the extended 2 months of NHL bubble, which is 8 positive tests within a single team today. Germany, which has been put back in quarantine till Christmas Eve, canceled both their exhibition games, and potentially, they brought 27 players over. If the positive test players can't play, it means they have 19 players to start the tournament, and the minimum is 18. So, and who knows if some of them are goalies? There's any number of permutations to that crisis, but that was not welcome news today at all.
Yeah. COVID keeps winning. So, but the vaccine will end that win streak. So that's the light at the end of the tunnel here, and see how it all plays out. So Bruce, let's talk a little bit. We'll finish up with the goalie piece for the coming into the season. I just want to. So when I had talked about the best prospect pools of the Edmonton Oilers history, I had suggested it last time that it was 1980. But if you think about the class of 1979 for the Oilers, it has to include Wayne Gretzky, and I hadn't done that initially. Now the NHL didn't consider him a rookie.
Nope.
And that really upset. And I'm going to say, for my purposes, I say that he should have been considered an NHL rookie. The NHL didn't consider WHA statistics to be official statistics. Right. They didn't consider it an official league. It really was the equivalent of somewhere between the AHL and the NHL. It wasn't NHL quality hockey at that. It was, close-ish, but
getting closer by the year.
Closer by the year. But Wayne Gretzky was a rookie, and I'm going to say I'm including him in the newcomer rookie prospect. I'm considering him as in that class, along with Risto Siltanen and Dave Hunter. And when I include those players, and Mark Messier, because I'd included Messier, but really under the same standard, he shouldn't have been included. So if you go, if that rookie class, that prospect class had Gretzky, Messier, Kevin Lowe, Glenn Anderson, Charlie Huddy, Risto Siltanen, and Dave Hunter, it is. I can't imagine. Now there might be some Montreal Canadiens newcomer class that had a similar number of Hall of Famers. If you went back,
McDonald, he never played in the NHL before he came in with the Oilers. It's
I would put an age limit on it. Like there has, like you're playing with history a little bit. You're trying to go with what makes sense. Mm-hmm. So you're right. There's some older players on that had never played in the NHL, but I wouldn't consider them rookies because of their age. So if you go with like under 22 maybe, and if that's your kind of cutoff line, something like that, I think you can think of something fair. Anyway, I'm going to say that class of incoming players, newcomers to pro hockey, not really to pro hockey, but
then you may have the greatest class in the history of the league, let alone the Oilers, if you're including all those guys as prospects.
which I think is fair to do.
Okay.
All right. And then, so where does this latest group rank for the Oilers? I'd say the class of 2019, which is Yamamoto, Bear, Jones, Marino, who ended up in Pittsburgh, obviously. Bouchard, Broberg, Lavoie, Samorukov, Maximov, Benson, Lagesson, McLeod, and Kesselring is that's the deepest pool the Oilers have probably ever had in terms of people who might make the NHL. And if you add Holloway's, Savoie, and Tullio to that group, this is just a very, very, very deep group of prospects for the Edmonton Oilers. It's an outstanding group, Bruce. There's all kinds of players within that group who have the potential to be top pairing demon, certainly top four demon in the NHL, and also a number of them now who have the potential to be top six forwards. Yamamoto's already broken in as one. So there's 3 or 4 forwards who could be in the top 6. There's 3 or 4 defensemen who could be in the top 4. And that's really great work by the Oilers organization over the last 5 years to accumulate that kind of talent. And the only question I was left with is, are we going to squander this group of talent?
Right.
What do you think of this prospect pool, though, overall? Like, when you think of it, how would you rate it, Bruce?
I like it for depth. The high-end talent is, the top guys are obviously good players, but there's no sort of overarching superstars up there. There's no Gretzky's or Messier's, to put it that way. I would counter that in retrospect, if we revisited the class of 2015, which had McDavid, which had Nurse, who hadn't played. We disqualified Draisaitl because he'd used up his rookie status the year before, although he was still very much seriously a prospect. But in 2015, we didn't know what we had yet, but already Bear, Jones, Marino, who's gone now, were in that mix. Griffin Reinhart, who was an NHL rookie, as I recall him, maybe not. He was.
He was.
Yeah, he was. He played 8 games in New York, and he played. Yeah. Anyway, he was a rookie, and he would have been highly rated at that time, obviously, given what they gave up for him. So maybe that class. I mean, we obviously have a much finer focus now on guys like Bear and Jones, where in 2015, they were in the pound. I think we rated them fairly high because we liked what we saw, but it was way, way early days. So sometimes you kind of have to go back a few years and when these guys first came in, and maybe you can find a different group. I mean, McDavid alone makes the 2015 group stand out from anything else that we've seen in recent years. So
yeah, but the 2014-15 group, if you put Draisaitl and McDavid together, like if there's a kind of a cluster of player with Clefbaum included in that, Nurse. I mean, Gustafsson they let slip through their fingers. Eric Gustafsson. There's other, there's Pitlick and Osterley in that same group, Joe Jarkera. Right. So there's some okay-ish depth players. That's not a bad group. 2014-15 is a pretty, that's the heart of this team is McDavid and Draisaitl, obviously, and Nurse and Clefbaum if he was healthy, but that's a very strong cohort as well. And, in terms of elite talent in this latest group, Broberg and Bouchard could become elite NHL hockey players, and maybe one of the forwards, maybe Lavoie, maybe Holloway, maybe Savoy. Like there's some candidates to be elite forwards in the NHL.
Right.
We just don't know. Maybe Yamamoto is going to be an elite forward in the NHL over time. I mean, he's certainly trending that way right now. His points per game in the last half of the season was elite. So, Bruce, this is a really, really hopeful group. And the issue then becomes, are they going to squander this group, this talented group of players? And the Oilers have a terrible history of squandering talent. And it started for economic reasons under Peter Pocklington. They obviously squandered the talent on those Stanley Cup winning teams. They probably would have won 1 or 2 or 3 more Stanley Cups than they did if they hadn't sold off Gretzky and Messier and Curry and traded off all these other players, Coffey and Anderson and Fuhrer and endless list of players. And that continued on when they got rid of Dom Foose and Joe Murphy and Madsen and Curtis Joseph, Doug Waite. They just couldn't hold on to players, increasingly for economic reasons, because the Oilers' revenues were the lowest in the league or the second lowest in the league for a number of years. But then the squandering got worse.
Sorry, those second generation trades, when they traded the guys that they got for the first guys that they traded, and when they moved on from the second guys, when they moved away from Vincent Foose, for example, that they gave up Anderson and Fuhrer to get, and they got a good player back, and then they moved him out for Shane Carson. Each time it seemed like they were trading down and getting a lesser player back than the guys that they moved on from. And then they started trading away younger guys or losing younger guys like Jeff Bukaboom and Adam Graves to the Rangers. It was, they were taking a dive off the high board at that point.
So it was always, at that point, from about 1991 to 2005 till the new CBA, it was for economic reasons that the Oilers would move out talented players. So you're squandering them in the big picture. There was an economic reason that happened. We were kind of a second, we were kind of like lower Premier League team selling to the top Premier League teams, our players, for a football analogy. And that's what happened. And it was really hard to take as an Oilers fan. Yep. And such great news when the CBA changed, and also Edmonton's economy changed. We became a boom economy from 1998 to 2015, 2014. This city just boomed because of the oil sands, and it changed the economics of the Oilers as well. They made more money as a franchise. The CBA improved, and then they got the new arena, and they got a new, more wealthy owner in Daryl Cates, more willing to spend money. I don't know if he's more wealthy than some of the guys in the EIG, but he definitely was more willing to spend money on the team. But we still lost players, Bruce. Mm-hmm. And this is where we get into the era where, and I'm going to say the theme is a consistent undervaluing of the talent on your own team and wishing they were something else, wishing they were something more, and getting rid of them because of that. Usually because they weren't gritty enough, I believe. So we lost players like, we had some good veteran players and we just lost them. And players that were lost because they weren't gritty enough, I'm going to say Kyle Brodziak was sent away. Maybe Andrew Cogliano, Tom Gilbert. And the one that hurts Oiler fans the most is the Jeff Petry trade, because it set off a whole lot of bad things in motion. It set off the Oilers not having a top D-man, so Justin Schultz was thrown into the fire. So they had to trade Adam Larson, to fill that hole. They had to trade Taylor Hall to get Adam Larson. The other thing it set off was possibly the Oilers winning the lottery to get Connor McDavid, though. So, what's your take?
The two are irretrievably connected.
Why do you think they squandered the talent so much, Bruce? They had decent veteran talent and they just kept getting rid of it.
I've never been able to understand it, David. I mean, you can look at any team, any successful team, and you'll find players, rank and file players within that team that were drafted or acquired as very young pre-NHL players by that organization that are dotted throughout the lineup, not just top line guys, but second, third, fourth line guys, spares, tweeners, third pairing defensemen. And with the Edmonton Oilers, it seemed like if a draft pick turned out to be an NHLer, but he wasn't a top line player, they'd just get rid of him. I mean, here's a list. This is draft picks chosen in the top 50. So this is a relatively, small number of picks in a 9-year span, 2002 to 2010. Jarrett Stahl traded at 26. Matt Green traded at 25. Mark Pouliot released at 25. Devin Dubnyk traded at 27. Andrew Cogliano traded at 24. Jeff Petry traded at 26. Sam Gagner traded at 24. Jordan Eberle traded at 27. He's the old man in this crew. Magnus Pajärvi traded at 22. Anton Lander released at 26. Taylor Hall traded at 24. 11 guys picked in the top 50, and none of them stuck around. They got rid of all of them in their mid-20s. All of them.
And a lot of those. And a lot of them went on to be good players. Like maybe Pajärvi didn't ever get any better, but
right.
But Lander was a decent fourth line center, and all the other guys had really good years. All of them had, like some of them had exceptionally good years. Like Stoll and Matt Green were useful depth players on a team that won 2 Stanley Cups. That doesn't include Curtis Glencross, right?
Right.
Who they just inexplicably didn't sign after he was obviously a decent hockey player. Raffi Torres they got rid of. They got rid of Raffi Torres, who was still when he was 26, and he went on to have. Now I understand there might have been with all of these players, like there's always rumors like why they got rid of these players. So some of them, maybe needed a change of scenery. I'll grant them that, but all of them needed a change of scenery. Maybe the change of scenery needed to happen in Edmonton with the management being better managers. And I know that you and I at the time, we would often defend, like people are going to say, oh, you and Bruce, you defended those guys. And we did at times too. Like that's true. So
I have consistently railed against this aspect of the Oilers, though, not keeping their own players. That list that I cited you comes from a post I wrote in March of 2019 titled, "If Edmonton Oilers want to grow an organizational culture, maybe they could try hanging on to their own players." That would have been a change. And I think it's changing with Ken Holland, and this is why I will defend Ken Holland. I'm seeing steps in that direction, that he's nurturing and developing and growing the organization from inside. And even when Detroit was a bad team at the end of his tenure, it was a team of players that was grown from within, players that had value, that other teams valued, that when they traded them, they didn't get nothing in return. They actually got something back for them. But one of the things here was Oilers kept changing out their GM. And every time they brought in a new GM, he would seem to, like, he'd get rid of the bottom 6 from the previous team, and he'd bring in a whole new bottom 6, but it would all be guys from other teams. And there would never be, guys bubbling up from under that stuck around. And
McT did a lot of good in terms of drafting Draisaitl and Nurse, like 2 huge pieces that Craig McTavish acquired. But his undervaluing of Jeff Petry was a major mistake. And I did a fan poll, and that, along with the Griffin Reinhart trade, were identified as the 2 biggest squandering of assets in that whole decade of darkness. That's what fans thought were the 2, and even more than the Taylor Hall trade, for instance, Bruce, which had considerably less support as the worst move. Those 2 things, the Petry trade and I would also think, to me, I hated the Tom Gilbert trade for Nick Schultz. From the day Nick Schultz came, he was never as good a player as Tom Gilbert was. And, maybe I like Tom Gilbert a little bit. Maybe I overrated him a little bit, but he by the end of his time in the NHL with the Oilers, Tom Gilbert was a serviceable, probably number 3 defenseman in the NHL. Like they had him on the top pairing at Edmonton because they had nobody else, but he was hanging in there in that role in kind of a similar way, like to Oscar Klefbom right now, like playing at a similar level as that. He wasn't that bad a player, and they just threw him away for a guy who was past his best before date in Nick Schultz. And Tamby, I don't know what Tamby was thinking. I guess he thought this was the answer. Nick Schultz.
Yeah. Well, and there are individual trades that certainly are going to be defended as hockey trades. I have people whose opinion I respect who still like the trade of Jarrett Stahl and Matt Green for Lubomir Wisnowski. And on the surface, the Oilers got the best player in that trade in Wisnowski, but he played 100 games in Edmonton, and they got rid of 2 guys that they drafted 6 years before. They moved away from them. These are guys, played with the Oilers in the Stanley Cup Finals. They would go on to play in 2 more finals and win them both in Los Angeles. And the same year that they traded Rafi Torres and they brought in the kid there, Gilbert Brule, and again, a 26, 27-year-old Oiler lifer, gone. See ya. We've had enough. And I mean, none of those guys were world beaters, but they were all NHL caliber players. And
Matt Green probably was one of the leaders on that team, Bruce. Like they talked about a lack of culture on that team. Well, you trade away the guy who is who sets the tone, who sets the culture, even though he's not your best player, and you bring in, I don't know what Lubos Vishnowski's personality was like, but maybe I don't know. I can't say. But if you trade a character player, and let's say in theory you trade a character player for kind of a guy who's passing through, who's a quiet guy, a good guy, but it's not a leader in any way, even if he is a talented player. So the Oilers they were clueless, obviously. Under the Tambellini era, it's pretty clear they were utterly clueless. And Kevin Lowe's great mistake as an Oilers manager was stepping away from the GM job himself and hiring the wrong guy. And that's clearly what happened with Tambellini. And I defended Tamby for a long time, so I can't. I was wrong. I was wrong to do that. He was just not the right guy for that role. And McTavish was better, I think, than Tambellini, but he also made mistakes and some fairly major ones. And he didn't sign
hiring Dallas Aikens.
Yes.
Who proceeded to alienate a number of Oilers players, including the aforementioned Jeff Petry, who in Game 3 of the 2014-15 season, when he was on his challenge contract, Game 3 in Los Angeles against the Stanley Cup champions, Game 3 of the season, Aikens benched Jeff Petry with his family in town to watch him play. So that he could give Darnell Nurse at age 19 his NHL debut against the Stanley Cup champions. Final score 6-1 LA. And just one of a series of, I don't like saying unforgivable, but close, unexplainable, unforced errors by Dallas Aikens. It was... And, he lost Neal Yakupov similarly very, very early in the previous season when he benched him for a pair of high-profile games. And I think he lost the kid in the process.
Yeah. I just think they had this missing middle on the team for a long time because they traded away all these veterans. And if they had kept Green and Matt Green as a leader on the team, and Stoll and Brodziak, and maybe these guys develop into, maybe they needed to learn as leaders, but Green certainly had that potential, and Cogliano, and so then Hall, these younger players like Hall and Eberle get better leadership. They become slightly different players because of that. There's just a different vibe on that team because there's a strong leadership core, and the Oilers essentially just blew it up. They tried to import leadership, and it didn't work.
But why keep Andrew Cogliano as a role player when you can bring in Eric Belanger and Ben Eager?
Exactly. Precisely. And then you have Glenn Cross. I think Glenn Cross was seen as a character and a gritty, hardworking player in Calgary. They stripped the team of those players, and it didn't work out. So now let's move to the future, Bruce. Here's the thing I would say about Ken Holland. Like you recognized this last year. Every player that came in, they seemed to have at least a plan for him. He was going to get this window of opportunity to prove himself, and this includes players like Granlund. It was Marcus Granlund, right? That's one we had here. Marcus Granlund and Thomas Yurcho and players like that, like who are now long gone, but they all had their little moment in the sun where they had this opportunity. And it seems like before Holland moves on from players, there's just more of a process. And I would include Matt Benning in this, because Matt Benning comes the closest to, have they thrown away another veteran leader on this team, who's just heading into his prime years and is going to be a character guy and could provide team leadership. But I would say that they gave Matt Benning every opportunity to become a real part of this team and a vital part of this team. And in the end, I think was found just a little bit wanting, and they decided to move on. So they're bringing in Tyson Barrie instead, but I think that's really defensible as a hockey move. Like it's actually, I would say, an essential hockey move. They've got to get better puck moving defensemen. They've got to move that puck better. They can't have that same inefficiency in that area. And so I don't see the Benning move as the same, let's say, as moving out Matt Green for Wishnowsky. I mean, I guess you could there could be an equivalency between the two moves, but I think this will work out better. And I also think the Oilers they actually have the middle now. They have this core group of players, and it's McDavid heading into his prime, Draisaitl, Darnell Nurse, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. They have that veteran group of players. So Matt Benning, they might miss him, and he might actually help Nashville, but I don't think they're going to miss him in a way that he's not going to be as central a player as Matt Green and Stoll and Curtis Glencross would have been at that time, Brodziak to the Oilers. Like, they have their central players, and they're actually, fortunately, the team's best players this time. So it's a little different. And so I'm hopeful Holland will do a better job.
Yeah, well, I think, the track record says he's going to do it different than what we've seen. And the stability of him, having a 5-year contract, mind you, Chiarelli had similar, and he didn't last the 5 years. But I think there's going to be a more sort of a longer term, big picture, long view of how the team is developed than some of the piecemeal stuff that we've been subjected to over the years.
Well, Chiarelli's mistake, he did some things right. He made some good trades in the first year, brought in Talbot and Patrick Maroon and Zach Kassian, but he again tried to rush things and push things too fast. So he tried to use free agent signings and trades to push things. So this explains the Griffin Reinhart trade, and explains the Milan Lucic signing, and he's trying to rush things along, and it just never seems to work out, does it, when you try to rush? And what we see with Holland is a very, so far at least, it's just been a short period of time, of course, but what we are seeing is patience preached and patience being enacted, and before our very eyes. Let's go back to that list of prospects for a second here. And, Yamamoto, let's start with Yamamoto. He was not rushed even last year. He was sent to the minors until Christmas, just like they said he was going to be. And how did that work out?
Better. I mean, the thing with Yamamoto, if you look at his track record, the first year after he was drafted, he was put right in the NHL. Then he was sent back. And the second year after he was drafted, he was put right in the NHL. And then he was sent down to the minors. And each year, there was sort of a feeling of somehow failure in this player, that he was given his chance and he didn't cut the mustard. And then only in the third year did they finally start the guy in the freaking AHL as a developing player, and then call him up when he was ready. I mean, they finally got the horse in front of the cart. And hey, it worked. Who knew?
So with all of these players, it'll be interesting to see what happens, like with Dylan Holloway and Savoie, because if they tear it up in the NCAA this year, which they could each easily well do, I wonder how long they'll stay there. I guess it's partly up to them, but the whole question is how quickly they're going to be. Developing in the AHL is just as good as developing in the NCAA for really talented hockey players. So maybe that's where they're going to head. But I just see, Bouchard is not being rushed along. They're talking about Broberg heading back to Sweden right after Maddie wrote this week that right after the World Juniors over, Broberg's going to go right back. Broberg's going right back to Sweden. Okay. Yeah, Maddie had.
I thought he might be in training camp and then back. I was sure he wasn't going to make the team, but I thought they might give him some time.
I just think that's the exact right decision. I would have been
No,
okay if he was in training camp and then send him
yeah.
back. But on the other hand, just send him back. Like that's the right league for him this year. You and I've been watching him there. We see the development, these kind of up and down, trending upward development. I think that's happening with this player in Kaleftia, and I think that's where he should be this year. So Samarukov's staying in the KHL all year long. Part of this is related to COVID, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Raphael Lavoie is staying in Sweden all year. We'll see what Ryan McLeod would.
I
He's
think he'll
not.
be
He's coming
taxi
over.
squad. I think he'll be taxi squad, McLeod.
Yeah, or in the AHL if there's an AHL this year. So and Lagoson's the same thing. Lagoson will be either taxi squad or with the
I
Oilers.
think he's number 7.
Yeah, and he should be. Benson's the same thing. He should be taxi squad of the Oilers or the AHL, one of those. So they're bringing over the right guys in there, but they're also key. It's really good for Samorukov and Raphael Lavoie to get that full year over in Europe. And Tyler Tullio, it's good he went over there because now there's talk that the OHL season may be canceled altogether, is the latest rumors circulating.
The Dub put off their already delayed start, which was January 4th or 5th or something, or right after the World Junior maybe. It was early January, and all they've announced is it's been further delayed. So the odds are starting to build that the whole season might just be a write-off.
The Oilers are interestingly inoculated from the major junior leagues not playing this year in Canada because they have not one, if I'm not mistaken, they don't have one prospect who will sit out for that reason. Every single Oiler prospect is playing in Europe right now or in U.S. college. So that's kind of
they only drafted one. Yeah, was Tullio.
And he's now over there.
Last year they drafted Lavoie, but he was a 19-year-old, so last year would have been his last year in junior anyway. So he would have been AHL bound if there were any, but so they've really gone away from the CHL and especially the WHL these last few years after picking a lot of would-be prospects from the Dub. They've almost completely gone away from it.
Maximov, is he staying over there? Do we know? I can't remember.
I believe so.
Yeah.
I think the guy's loaned to the KHL. The loan was for the season.
Yeah, so that was a really solid move by the Oilers. And I don't know where the other teams sit. Like if they're European players, if there's a lot more players kind of in limbo on other teams sitting around and not playing, but it's working out. And so the Oilers are going to get a full year of development for all of these players. The only player that the Oilers allowed to slip through their fingers was John Marino. And that is obviously, viewed 20 years from now when you forget the circumstances, that doesn't look good, right? It's like Gustafsson leaving, maybe worse. It's like
Toby Reeder leaving.
Riley Nash or Reeder not signing. On another level, what can you do with any of these guys, Nash or Reeder or Gustafsson, if they don't, if the Oilers were keen to sign them and the players just didn't want to sign here? And that's definitely the sense I get with Marino. He just wasn't going to sign here. It's
not after Chiarelli left.
It happened on Holland's watch, but really, I have a hard time blaming Holland for that because it's just essentially these players are free agents, and they put the team in a tough position. And what can you do? You just have to move on, suck it up, and move on. It's the hazard of drafting NCAA players. It could happen with Kesselring. It could happen with Holloway or Savoie in theory. Anytime the player goes that route, that's a possibility. But I don't see it happening with any of those three, and it didn't happen with Kemp, who I thought it might happen with. So, yeah. Any final thoughts on whether they'll squander them or not, Bruce? Or
well, they'll squander some of them just because of sheer numbers, but also, sheer numbers. They're not all going to reach the highest level of their promise either. Injuries are going to happen, or guys are going to fall off, or they're going to reach a level that, that they just can't succeed at anymore. But I'd like to think there's enough talent spread among enough players that you're going to be able to build in some of these depth players within your organization. If you develop a top liner or two, like Kyler Yamamoto promises to be. Well, obviously, so much the better. But, I mean, I default to the Tampa Bay Lightning roster, where sure they got their high-end stars like Braden Point and Nikita Kucherov that they drafted in the second round, both of them. But you look all through their lineup and you find guys like Cedric Paquette and Anthony Cirelli and uh, Alex Killorn, guys they drafted in some cases years ago and, mid-round draft pick. And yet those guys are part of the heart and soul of that team.
The biggest threat to the Oilers to squandering this talent is if they sign veteran players to long-term contracts who no longer perform and they block they block roster spots. So how many players do the Oilers have like that? Well, they have James Neal, right? Who probably, might not have gotten a contract with the Oilers for this coming season under other circumstances. So they have Alex Chason, who actually I think is a decent NHL player still.
One year, that's a different
for
story.
One more year. But so he's not really in theory, like he's blocking Puljujärvi in theory a little bit right now, but that might work out. But so they have James Neal, and the other threat for blocking is obviously Zach Kassian. If Zach Kassian doesn't turn out as a player, he's going to be taking up a roster spot for the next 4 years and could block. But on defense, there's Clefbaum has got 3 years left on his deal, but they don't. Other than that, Bruce, they're in a good position to have in kind of in a regular basis roster spots open up. So as long as they don't give too many, if they don't go for that quick fix and sign that 27, 20, like I think what Montreal did this year, signing all these guys 26, 27, 28 to long-term deals, kind of iffy players. To me, that's Steve Tambellini style NHL leadership in my view. And maybe Montreal will prove me wrong in the long term, but that's what I see in Montreal. But the Oilers, other than Neal and possibly Kassian, don't really have those kind of contracts that screw up a team so badly. Tampa's kind of in that situation now where they're kind of clogged up with those contracts. Edmonton could easily get in that situation, Bruce, if they sign players to deals and they don't perform, but they're not there right now.
Well, those are internally paid players, at least in Tampa's case, where they didn't go out and pay a big stack of money for a long time for free agents. They just developed guys that became good enough that they had to pay them, which is kind of the ideal. And when it comes to veteran players, that's where 1 year contracts, 2 years marginally so, 1 year contracts are your friend. I mean, if the Oilers had signed Tyson Barrie for 4 years, where does that leave Evan Bouchard? Right? They sign him for 1 year. A year from now, that picture may be drastically changed, and the Oilers might say, "Well, we've got Evan Bouchard ready to go, and Tyson Barrie's asking for $6 million now. We're just going to have to move on and use that money for something else." And they'll have an option. Whereas if they lock the guy up for 3 or 4 years, then they're kind of hamstrung in what they can do.
I guess Turris and Archibald both signed 2-year deals, so in theory they could be blocking. If they don't pan out, like if Turris falls off a cliff this year, they got him another year and they're kind of stuck with him. But those contracts are low enough, that you could bury the guy. And if a guy comes up on a minimum contract, it works out to about the same. So they're not really blocking. Anyone earning close to the league NHL minimum is not really blocking other players in any real dramatic sense, like James Neal is, right? Like that's a major blocking. Like let's face it, Neal right now is blocking Nygaard and Puljujärvi and Tyler Benson and players who might be better than him this year from getting on the roster or getting more playing time. And he's got to really perform for the Oilers not to be, and that's of course an after effect of the Milan Lucic contract.
Right.
So
I was just going to say,
ouch. Bruce, let's talk about
paying for that mistake.
At least James Neal had a decent year last year. And he was good in the playoffs. Like Lucic wasn't even good in the playoffs the 1 year that they made the playoffs. So James Neal was, I thought, an effective playoff player. And I'm hoping that with kind of spot duty, that they can get 1 more year, at least 1 more year at a Neal where he's good on the power play, okay-ish at even strength. And then when you get to the playoffs, because he's a veteran guy, he cranks it up and can help the team win. So I'm not like I there's some things that I really like about James Neal's game right now still. So this isn't the disaster that I think Lucic was, honestly. Like I didn't like anything about Lucic's game in the last year with the Oilers.
But that contract isn't one of the things you like.
No, it ain't.
And you're right. I mean, it's a
Mhm.
roadblock, and the fewer of those you have, especially in the guys on the downside of the curve, the better.
The bigger mistake, I think, obviously, right, like to me, is the big. If you want to blame Holland for anything, it's the Cassian contract, right? Now he couldn't anticipate COVID, and this was signed pre-COVID. And if he had just waited another 2 months, everything would have changed. So, but
Yep.
this contract it can be seen right now as a mistake, and how much the Oilers pay for that mistake is yet to be seen. Hopefully, Zach Cassian can continue to at least be a really useful fourth line player in all 4 of those years of that contract, but that's yet to be seen. And you always do need that really tough, aggressive presence on a team, and he can provide that. So it's easy to see him having at least fourth line value. He might be overpaid, but that might not, with so many young players bubbling up, that might not be such an issue. Bruce, let's talk about the goalies. What are you thinking about heading into this year? Mark Spector wrote about this. You've written about this.
Mhm.
What's your take?
Yeah, I missed Spector's article, so mine is completely independent of that. But presumably he may have reached some of the similar conclusions. I mean, the obvious thing here is that they've gone back with what they know. Uh, they were locked into Mikko Koskinen's deal, which had 2 years to run at $4.5 million, which was Peter Chiarelli's last contribution to the Oilers situation. But they uh, when Holland in the first day of free agency, the goal he made a serious offer on Jacob Markstrom, uh, reportedly 7 years at 5 million, and possibly even 5 point X million. And Markstrom eventually signed with Calgary for 6 years at 6 million. And the same day that that was happening, a whole bunch of other goalies uh, were signing elsewhere. Cam Talbot went to Minnesota. Braden Holtby went to Vancouver. Matt Murray, that the Oilers had also expressed some interest in, signed a long-term deal in Ottawa. Uh, that some of them, Henrik Lundqvist, who's now apparently out for the season with a heart issue and probably retired, uh, he had signed with Washington. That all happened on the first day of free agency. I'm tempted to say July 1st, except for it was something like October 9th this year, but the
Yeah.
very first day of free agency. Well, by the second day, equivalent to July 2nd, the goalie market was fairly limited. There were still a few guys out there. Some people liked Aaron Dell, the backup goalie for San Jose, that wound up signing an NHL minimum contract to be a third goalie in Toronto. Well, guys like that were available, but uh, Holland went back to Mike Smith. Uh, he gave him a substantial reduction in his contract, cut his base pay by 25%, and cut his potential bonuses, by something over 70%. Uh, in the process, he probably slashed $1 million from the goaltending budget. Uh, and he proceeded to use uh, the $1 million, you could say, is what he used to sign one of the players, say Dominic Kuhn. Not a bad get for $1 million. Uh, or you could say the money he didn't spend on Jacob Markstrom, he used to address a whole bunch of other issues on the roster. Tyson Barrie plus Mike Smith cost about the same that they would have paid for Jacob Markstrom. Plus, of course, they would have been locked into that contract for years and years. Uh, these guys both signed for 1 year. So it was a reorganization of the budget. And of course, the question is the goaltending that they had last year good enough to get the job done this year? Uh, I'd make the case they got the job done last year. There was a lot of shaky moments, but at least in the regular season, I mean, then you can point to that 4-game playoff series, and you can blame goaltending as part of the reason for the defeat, and you wouldn't be wrong. But you would be wrong if you said it was the whole reason. Uh, and they've got two returning veteran goalies. One thing Holland did in this summer was he signed I would say, a legit number three goalie with a decent amount of pro experience and some NHL experience. Whereas last year they didn't have a single goalie in the organization that had even a minute of NHL action beyond the two guys that played the whole season. Luckily, neither of them ever got hurt seriously enough to miss any time. But in Anton Forsberg, they now have what's obviously going to be a taxi squad goalie, the number three guy that they'll carry around with the team in the COVID situation. He's a sort of an ideal player to fill that role. And in a pinch, if Mike Smith turns into Jonas Gustafsson in 2017 and his game just falls apart, well, they could call up Anton Forsberg. They could send down Mike Smith. They'd have to eat some of Smith's contract, but they'd actually come out $375,000 ahead on cap space by making that transaction. So that's sort of putting a little extra pressure on Mike Smith from below to keep his game going and keep his game up. Now, I personally think that, Mike Smith, obviously his skills are eroding. His style is not for everyone. Some people absolutely hate the guy. I don't hate him, but, I know there's a lot better goalies out there, but he's one combative son of a gun. He reminds me of, the late career, which is all we saw of Dwayne Rollison. And he reminds me something of Rolly the goalie in terms of his approach to the game. And it's clear that both Holland and Tippett admire his competitiveness and his leadership. And then there's the extra degree of his puck handling that became something of a wild card factor in games that he played. But the team played better in front of Mike Smith. They did. They allowed 10% fewer shots on net for Smith than they did for Koskinen. And you can't say all of 10% is puck handling. They scored 13% more goals when playing in front of Smith than Koskinen. Is that random distribution? Well, maybe. As the team is more cohesive for some reason, well, who the hell knows? I'm not a mind reader, but the case can be made that the Oilers played better hockey when Mike Smith was in net behind him than they did for Mikko Koskinen. And whether that would hold true for 2021 is another question. But I guess they've made their bed.
Ken Holland clearly signaled that he thought goaltending was the biggest weakness on the Oilers when he offered that contract to Markstrom. I found it an alarming contract. I think it would have been a huge mistake. And of all the things that Ken Holland has done so far as GM, it's the thing that worries me the most, that I just am not a fan of giving huge money, long-term 7-year contracts to 31-year-old or wherever the heck Markstrom was players. I just think it was a colossal bullet dodged from the Oilers. Glad he went to Calgary. So, but that said, Holland himself sent a clear message that he doesn't believe that this goaltending is good enough. And that was, I'm not going to disagree with that. They weren't good enough. They were weak in the playoffs. That said, Bruce, if you want to go with the glass half full approach, I heading into last year, I had more questions about the goaltending than I have this year.
Right.
Koskinen played better last year than he had the year before. He was really good in the regular season. He was genuinely solid. I think Mikko Koskinen is a decent to good NHL goalie. And if he plays like he did last year, the Oilers are going to be okay because he's a good goalie. The question is the backup. And I don't know, Mike Smith, if you want to go with glass half full, you could say he had one terrible month or 6-week stretch, and the rest of the year he was really good. And if he's just healthy and doesn't get overplayed, he'll be fine. So you could say that. On the other hand, he's had 2 years where he's had essentially a 900 save percentage, 898, I think, and 900, and he's not getting any better. There's no reason to expect him to improve on that. He gets banged up. He has terrible stretches in the year. and they probably should have moved on from him, would be one thought. And the coach also has a sweet tooth for him. So tends, in theory, the Oilers should have moved on another goalie last January 1st. Like after Smith's terrible run of play, they could have sent him to the minors, gotten rid of him, and traded for another goalie. It turns out that Mike Smith had his best run of play in the final. Yep. That was good that he didn't do that. So maybe, I think Koskinen is a good goalie. I wish they had brought in I think they could have brought in another backup goalie, but they did in Forsberg. A very, very good minor league goalie who has had limited success at the NHL, although in his one lengthy stretch as a backup goalie in the NHL, he had a .908 save percentage in Chicago one year. I think he played 20 to 30 games.
35 games. He actually he played the most games of any Chicago goalie. Crawford got hurt, and Forsberg played a bunch. He outplayed the other backups, and he was number one for a while. And then Crawford came back, and that was that.
So that's not on a strong defensive team. I don't believe the Blackhawks
wasn't a good team at that point.
So if he could, let's say, if Koskinen can be at 9-15, and Forsberg or Smith can be at 9-10, then that's good enough goaltending for the Oilers to make the playoffs this year. That'll be good enough. If Koskinen can ratchet it up somehow, maybe into the 9-20 range, and the backup goalie can be like 9-10. Then the Oilers are one of the better teams in the league, probably, because I think the other elements of the team are there. They're going to score goals. They just need some saves, and they need stronger defensive play, which will also come from, we've heard about Darnell Nurse talking about wanting to ramp it up defensively, and that's music to my ears, because the very best players on this team, Draisaitl, McDavid, and Nurse, have got to be better defensively for the Oilers to be an elite hockey team. That's a given, and I think that they're coming to that same conclusion, and I think having Draisaitl and McDavid at center will full time will greatly facilitate that. But Bruce, I'm kind of the glass half full, because I think the Oilers have a good goalie in Koskinen, and they've got a decent bet in Forsberg, if not Smith, to be the backup goalie. So I think the Oilers' goaltending situation is better this year.
Well, Koskinen, he posted a .917 save percentage last year, which was basically the same as $5 million man, $6 million man Jacob Markstrom.
Yep.
And it was the exact same as Stanley Cup winning goalie Andrei Vasilevsky, .917. That's a good number. It's not like high end, but it's up there with, it's not a problem when your goalie is stopping 11 shots out of 12, which is what .917 is. He did get banged up in a game on New Year's Eve against the Rangers, where the Oilers almost blew a 6-0 lead and wound up hanging on to win 7-5.
I remember that.
And he got hurt early in the third period, and then they gave him 4 goals in a row. And then they went on the road, and Mike Smith started the first 4 games of the road trip, and the Oilers came out of those games with 7 points. And from then on, like in 2020, the Oilers played 29 games. Smith started 19 of them, Koskinen 10. And so the idea that Mike Smith starting in the first playoff game was somehow an out-of-mind choice by the coach, there's more than one way to look at it. I'll just leave it there. It's a guy that he'd been relying on throughout January, February, and into March. Was the guy he started with, and he certainly moved away from him quickly when things went badly. So,
yeah, I guess. But Koskinen played the exhibition game against Calgary,
started
in the playoffs. Started it, and anyway, this will be an ongoing thorn in everybody's side, no doubt, and a source of much controversy. But I like Mikko Koskinen at Bruce. I think he's a good goalie. He's just this huge guy, and when he's on his game, and he's often on his game, the other team starts losing their confidence and missing the net on their shots and getting really frustrated. And he didn't play well in the playoffs, so I just think there's a huge recency bias against both Smith and Koskinen. which is warranted because it's everything to play well in the playoffs on a certain level. Like that's what it's all about, is coming through in the playoffs. It's why I've always ranked Grant Fuhr ahead of Andy Moog, because he just was I thought a significantly better playoff player than Andy Moog was. So there is that, but I'm generally okay. I'm probably wrong. Maybe it's going to be a big disaster for the Oilers, but I just hope. I see some reason for hope.
They had if there is a Canadian division, the Oilers had the second best goals against average of any of the Canadian teams last year. So
there you go.
It's not like, I mean, they're average. Canadian division teams are all fairly average, other than Ottawa. But the Oilers were 15th out of 31 in the NHL, if you prefer to look at it that way, in goals against average, and that was with a ton of empty net goals against. And they had, it was obviously not ideal, but the two of them between them had a .910 save percentage, which is exactly the league average. So I don't see it as a big gaping hole that some do. And I do think they'll change the mix this year, and that Koskinen will play 60% to 40 for Smith, or even more. And they might even, with a 3-goalie system, Forsberg might play a little bit, might not. But I think Koskinen will emerge as the number one this year, playing a clear majority of the games.
Alrighty, so hopefully we'll get some news this week about when it all starts, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, that would be music to our ears to have some positive news. Time these days, I hear the word positive, it's because somebody tested positive.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, thanks for talking, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.